last time we talked about what I call the street farm model, which is sort of it's a framework that shows you how your thoughts ultimately lead to your results. So it's the acronym is STFAR. We talk about circumstances leading to our thoughts, and the thoughts being the point in the process that we have total control, right? The one point in the process where we have total control, because we can't control our circumstances. So our thoughts then are a function of what we tell ourselves about the circumstances, which we cannot control. And so we therefore have a choice. That thought then leads to feelings, right? And feelings are emotions, anger, usually just things that we can describe in one word: an anger, mad, sadness, happy, so on. And then those feelings then lead to our actions, right? So we act and we behave based on the way that we feel. And then those actions ultimately yield results or outcomes. And so that's sort of the progress. And so that's kind of a brief recap of what we talked about last week. So today I kind of want to expand on that. And I want to give you, I'll talk a little bit about fixed mindset versus growth mindset. And then I want to give you some rules of the mind. And we'll talk a little bit about how the mind can play tricks on us, how the mind regularly plays tricks on us, and how if we were to just sort of step in, we can sort of, take better control of what the mind does and all those tricks that it plays on us. So, I always I like to talk a lot about evolution, because it is so relevant to where we find ourselves today, with our own lives and with society. And so, scientists believe that human beings, our particular species, the Homo sapien, is somewhere around 300,000 years old. Now, there's a lot of controversy over this. 50 years ago, they said it was like 50,000 years ago, and then it was 100,000 years, and they keep changing the number. But the current thinking is that human beings are about 300,000 years old. So if you think about that time frame for a minute, that's a really long time frame, right? 300,000 years is a long time. And for 99% of that time, there were very few relative changes in society, right? I think it kind of breaks down to there was the invention of fire, right? The discovery of fire, that was a big change that occurred. It changed our biology because it changed the way we eat and so on. Then there was agriculture, right? That was the second big change. And both of those things happened a really long time ago. And then there was the Industrial Revolution, right? Leading into the technology revolution. But if you think about that time frame, things really went crazy and change was extremely dramatic when we hit that Industrial Revolution. But that was only like 200 years ago. So for, again, 99% of that time period, human beings were evolving with very little change, right? And we were tribal beings, we were hunter-gatherers, and we had a lot of risks and we had a lot of dangers in our life, right? We had to run from tigers, for example. And so where we are today is there has been so much change in the last 200 years that we're really kind of living outside of our evolution. An evolutionary change takes numerous, if not hundreds of generations to take place, right? So for example, when fire came along, it changed our digestion, but it took, hundreds of years, thousands of years for the digestion to fully change to adapt to the fact that we were now cooking our food. But all this change that we've had in the past couple of hundred years, we haven't had enough time to adapt to it, right? So we're really kind of like out of sorts. And the reason I'm telling you this is because I want to say that one of the things many people struggle with is sort of negative thinking, negative thinking versus positive thinking. Well, why do we have negative thinking? We have negative thinking because it's evolution, right? We were evolved to have negative thinking because we had so many risks. There were so many dangers that the brain needed to prepare us for these dangers. We needed to be sort of aware of the constant threat of the tiger jumping out of jumping from the savannah to come eat us, or whatever the threat was, a rival tribe. And so we have this sort of programming to negative thinking. But so many of those dangers have gone away, but we haven't had enough time to evolve to that. So we're still stuck in this default of negative thinking. The human brain has a default of negative thinking as opposed to positive thinking. And it's because we haven't had enough time to adapt to the fact that all those dangers no longer exist for us. Does this make sense what I'm saying?
Yes.
Yeah. And so you add on top of that all of the programming that we were raised with, right? So, every one of our experiences going back to our childhood, the way that we were brought up by our parents, our teachers, the neighborhoods that we grew up in, whatever, if you watched whatever media, books that you read, TV that you saw, all of these things had influences on you as you were growing up. And as you all know, children are especially impressionable. The child brain is extremely impressionable. And so you had all of this that was sort of programming you. We were taught, well, this is the way that you behave. You don't do these things. If you go climb the wall, you're going to fall down and hurt yourself, right? You have to go to school so that you can get a good job, so that you can go da 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 da. We have all this programming that is placed on top of our evolutionary sort of default of negative thinking. So you have a baseline of negative thinking, and then you have very specific programming that basically informs the way that you think. The way that you think today is a function of negative thinking plus all of the stuff that you were programmed with. And the thing is that, no one individual, whatever your experience was growing up, is unique to you, right? No one else had that experience. No one else had the influences of the specific teachers, family members, priests, whatever it is. All of those influences are very unique to you, but you're just one individual, right? So the possibility of experience is gargantuan, right? You don't have the same experience that I had, and you don't have the same experience that another person has, and yet all of those experiences represent possibility. So what happens to us, though, is we end up believing that our life is limited to our experience, when in fact there are many other options available to us, right? So you have that negative thinking plus all that programming that basically tends to create what we call a fixed mindset. And so, first of all, is this resonating? Is this what I'm saying sort of making sense? Yeah. So I'll give an example. This is something that I just sort of kind of realized. My wife Heather pointed this out. I used to tell this story, and I was telling my kids this story one day, where I was in kindergarten, and my kindergarten teacher was Mrs. Axelrod. And she may not be alive today, so I think I should feel free to mention her name. But if she does happen to hear this, I apologize if this disparages you, Mrs. Axelrod. But we were in class one day, and she pulled a small group of kids aside to do a little reading circle or something. So I remember very vividly sitting in a circle with about 6 other kids, and the teacher was sitting at the top of the circle. And she handed out a piece of paper. It was a white paper, and it had the outline of a horse on it. And she gave each kid a black crayon, and we were instructed to color a zebra. So I'm in kindergarten. I'm about 5 years old, and for whatever reason, I started overanalyzing this. I couldn't decide whether I wanted to make straight single lines down the horse to make a zebra, or whether I should make like 2 lines close together and then color them in to fill in a thicker stripe. So whether I wanted thin stripes or thick stripes. And I was very concerned. I remember this. I don't know why I remember this, but I remember being concerned about what other kids were going to do, right? And finally, I decided my inclination was to make thin stripes because it would be much neater, but I decided to make thick stripes. So I colored them in, and then it turned out being kind of messy. So I handed it back up to the teacher. And at this point, I had always ever gotten good grades. The grading system was, she had these stamps, and it would be a happy face or a straight face or a sad face. And that was the grading system. I'd only ever gotten happy faces. So she took my paper, and it was my zebra, and it was kind of messy. And she said, "This is kind of messy, Dale. This is not like your typical work." And she took the straight face stamp, and she stamped it with a straight face. And I got mad because I'd never gotten this. So what do you mean I don't get a straight face? And so I protested the straight face. And I tried to explain, well, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know whether you wanted thick stripes or thin. She wouldn't have any of it. She got mad at me for protesting. So she grabbed the paper back out of my hand. She scratched out the straight face, and she stamped a sad face on it. She gave it back to me. And of course I was traumatized. Well, anyway, that was an experience that I had. Now, also, I have grown up to be, I've always thought of myself as being a very left-brained person, right? I was good at math and science. And so my whole education has always ever been a very left brain, analytical, black and white. That's the way my brain works, right? I always told myself I was not creative. And it took a long time. It took maybe about 4 or 5 times of me telling that story. One day I was telling that story about Mrs. Axelrod to my kids, and Heather goes, "You know what? I wonder if that's why you don't think you're creative." And I thought about it. And I was like, holy crap. I think that is it. Because the fact is, I actually am creative. I've just never really known it because I've never let my brain believe that, because I, from the get-go, was told I couldn't color a zebra. And so for the rest of my life, up until recently, I have believed that I am not creative. I'm only a left brain person. And so it's these small little things. And I'm sure there were probably other occurrences that happened after the fact that went back and reinforced that belief, right? But the limiting belief for me was that I'm not creative. And so I just use that as an example. I'm going to come back to the story as I get further in the presentation, but I want that story sort of is just one example of the programming that I'm talking about. These little things which seem trivial. For the longest time, I remember that story because of the fact that it was emotional, right? And we always remember things that are emotional, but I never made the connection to the fact that Mrs. Axelrod had programmed me without even realizing it, right? It wasn't nefarious, but that's just what happened. And that's how we get programmed. So the other thing I kind of want to point out is this idea of the brain playing tricks. And so I have a couple of examples I want to give you. And we talked about this a little bit on the previous call. So the brain plays tricks. And actually, I think it was you, Leah, that pointed it out, right? The brain plays tricks. So have you ever had the experience where you've never heard of something before, and then somebody mentions it to you, and you're like, well, I've never heard of that before. And then all of a sudden you start seeing it everywhere? Have you ever had that experience? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So like, for example, somebody mentioned to me the other day, actually, this was a while ago, they mentioned the actor Ryan Reynolds. And I was like, who's Ryan Reynolds? And they're like, oh my God, you didn't know Ryan Reynolds? How embarrassing for yourself. How can you not know Ryan Reynolds? Well, like later that day, I was listening to the radio and a commercial comes on advertising Ryan Reynolds' next movie. And like the next day, I go to the movie and I see the preview, and all of a sudden, and then I'm seeing Ryan Reynolds on the headlines and the news, everything about Ryan Reynolds. Well, the reason, the brain is just playing tricks on you. So in this particular case, Ryan Reynolds was outside of my purview of experience, outside of my purview of knowledge. And so I'm sure that the name Ryan Reynolds had been placed in front of me in various instances, right? Because I'm not blind to the world, but my brain just wasn't picking up on it until somebody brought my attention to it. And then all of a sudden I see it everywhere, right? Another example of this I won't tell you which one of my kids, but I have a child that experiences this on occasion, which is, have you ever been trying to find something, whether it's your keys or whatever it is that you've lost, and you're going crazy, you can't find it. You ask someone, you ask your spouse or somebody, where is the thing? And they point it out to you, and it's like right in front of your face. Like, it's right there. How did you not see it? Right? Well, your brain is playing tricks on you. You might have a belief that says, I've lost the thing, or I can't find the thing, or I'm really bad at finding things. And that belief, quite likely, is what's causing you to not be able to see the thing that's right in front of your face. When you remove that belief, or that trick that your brain is playing on you, all of a sudden you see the keys, right? And it's just these tricks that the brain plays on us. So I'm sure these experiences resonate. I know I'm not the only one that has this stuff happen. Yeah. Okay. So the next thing I want to do is I want to go into, I'm going to share my screen, and I would like to talk about fixed mindset versus growth mindset, which is kind of just a natural progression to what we're talking about here. Let's see. Okay. Okay. Can everybody see the screen?
Yes.
Okay. Great.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So, give me 1 second. I'm trying to make it a little adjustment here. There we go. So fixed mindset versus growth mindset. What is a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset? Fixed mindset is when your general outlook on life is something along the lines of life is what it is. things are what they are. I can't change it. I just have to deal with it. Versus a growth mindset, which is more about, life is a progression. Um, Things are not necessarily stagnant in what I believe that they are. I can constantly change, right? So, for example, I've got a couple of quotes here on the page, as you can see. So, if you are presented with a challenge or something new that you haven't done before, right? If your response is along the lines of, "Are you sure I can do that? I don't think I have what that takes." That's a fixed sort of mindset. Versus, "I'm not sure I can do it now, but I think I can learn to do it with time and effort," right? Most successful people had failures along the way, right? As opposed to, "I'll be a failure. What if I fail?" So these are kind of the two different sort of ways of thinking. And it's important to point out that it's not like you're going to have a fixed mindset in every area of your life or a growth mindset in every area of your life. It just kind of depends, right? Some of us are fixed in some areas, other people are fixed in other areas, and so on, right? So it doesn't describe necessarily your total attitude or your total view of worldview, but it is kind of specific to certain areas. And it's not that one is bad or good. What it is, though, is a fixed mindset does tend to be, on some level, disempowering, where a growth mindset is the opposite of that, right? A growth mindset can be very empowering. And I'll give you an example of this from my personal life. So my mom passed away a couple of years ago, and she had lived her life taking care of my dad, because my dad had had a stroke early on. And so my mom had to take care of him for many, many years, like 30 years, I think, was the total time that my dad was around. And when he passed away in 2005, my mom, whose life purpose had essentially been taking care of my dad, suddenly found herself with nothing to do. And it was very difficult. And she never got over this. But it was very difficult for her to find something to do. In fact, she never really quite got there. Also, she didn't take very good care of herself. She was a heavy smoker, a heavy drinker. She didn't eat very well. And so this was kind of a pattern for her. And everybody in the family spent years trying to encourage her to make some changes, get out there, go volunteer for something, go get a job even, find some hobbies, cut down on take better care of your health, right? Stop the smoking, the drinking, get some exercise. And we were just on her constantly, tried different approaches, nothing ever worked. And she finally passed away in 2017. But looking back on it now and having learned the stuff about fixed mindset versus growth mindset, I can now recognize it. And I don't know that I would have been able to do anything different had I recognized this basic concept in the time. But my mom was in a fixed mindset, and now I see the same sort of thing happening. My childhood friend, and we're still best friends, his dad is now sick, and his dad is kind of in the same pattern, right? His dad has had cancer. He refuses to quit smoking. He continues taking poor care of himself. And his attitude about it is, well, this is the way I've always been. This is what I do. Smoking and drinking and do all the things are what makes me happy. And so there's that trap. It's that trap of being in the mindset, believing that the only way for you to be happy or the only way for you to be comfortable is to do all these bad behaviors. I can't do anything different. Nothing else can bring me happiness. This is just the way that it is. And that's a fixed mindset. And contrast, on the other hand, there's a book out there written by a man. His last name is Levitin. I think it's Dan Levitin. And he's a neuroscientist. And he writes that he's done a bunch of studies on longevity and people being happy or depressed or all these different mental states in their older years. And one of the things he has found is that when we are constantly challenging our brains, when we have a purpose and a reason to live, when we're doing something towards something, is when we are living longer and when we are living healthier, right? So when we're 95 years old and we're still driving on our own, still living by ourselves and being independent, those people more likely had something to keep them busy, and they were constantly learning new things and challenging themselves, right? So they were learning new languages, they were learning musical instruments, they were doing whatever it is, taking on new stuff to satisfy their life and help them live a fuller life. And so this is a growth mindset. And so because it is so easy for us to get stuck in that fixed mindset, I think it's important to sort of have this as a foundation to know that there is an alternative to a fixed mindset. Life doesn't have to be what it is, right? And again, there's no judgment on it, right? If that is not a bad thing or a good thing, it is just a thing, but it is also a thing that is not going to empower you to move forward. So I want to lay sort of that framework out because it goes to sort of my next point, which is going to be about what we call rules of the mind, and how we can use these rules of the mind to our advantage in combating that tendency to go back to a fixed mindset. Because again, if we go back to where I started, we have this foundation of negative thinking that we have brought to us from evolution, and we have all this programming that's going to tend to keep us in a fixed mindset, right? The saying that, we all become our parents. You guys are familiar with the saying, we become our parents, right? Well, why is that? Well, it's because that's what we know, right? That's what we were programmed with. We grew up thinking that it was right to do it this way. And then we think, well, there's no other way to do it. I've been doing it this way forever. And so it is very easy to fall into that fixed mindset mentality, but it doesn't have to be. And I'm going to get to that next. So I'm going to share my screen one more time. Okay, so I want to tell you a little bit about these rules of the mind. And this is not my content. This was created by a therapist out of the UK by the name of Marisa Peer. She's brilliant. She's written several books. I recommend checking her out. She's created this sort of framework that she calls rules of the mind. And I want to share a few of them with you because I think they're really helpful. So she says that the number one most important of all of these rules of the mind are that the mind does what it thinks you want it to do. And the way she describes this is, it's basically the idea that your words and your thoughts have power. By your words and your thoughts, you create a blueprint that your brain then feels compelled to make manifest, right? So the example that she gives when she talks about this idea is, for instance, let's say that you have a job and you're at work, and there's something that you're really, really dreading, right? Maybe it's your boss has asked you to make a presentation, you have to work on a particular assignment, and you're telling yourself, I'm dreading this, I'm going to die if I have to get on stage and do a presentation. I just hate this. I hate this, right? So what you're doing with those words is you're basically telling your brain that you don't want to do this. And your brain is going to automatically try to protect you, right? Again, going back to that whole nature thing, evolution, our brain is wired to protect us. And so what the brain may do, for example, is it may make you sick or give you the flu. Okay, you don't want to do the presentation, so now I'm going to give you the flu. I've done you a favor. Now you can stay home in bed. You don't have to go do the presentation, right? So every word and every thought is creating a blueprint for our brain to go and fulfill. If you tell yourself, as another example, if you tell yourself that you're going to fail at something, right? If you go into a new thing, or maybe something that you've done over and over, and you tell yourself, I'm going to fail at it, most likely you're going to fail at it, right? Not because you don't know how to do it, not because you don't have the right skills, or not because you're having bad luck, or not for any of these other reasons, but simply because you have basically requested of your brain to create the situation in which you're going to fail at the thing. And so this is not something this is fairly well known in science now. Just the idea that, going back to what I said about looking for your keys, if you remember that as an example, right? In the case of looking for your keys, you may have thought to yourself, I have no idea where the keys are. You may have thought to yourself, I am not good at finding things. I'm always losing my keys. And so when the keys are right in front of you, your brain is not processing them. You can't see them, right? Because your brain wants to manifest what you told it that you want. And so this happens. But it doesn't have to be, because if we're aware of it, then instead of saying to ourselves, I'm going to fail at that thing, we say, well, I'm going to succeed at that thing, right? Even though you don't necessarily believe it, but that's the word that you're saying. Those are the words that you're saying to yourself. And believe it or not, actually, the more you repeat that, the more you will end up truly believing it. But what you're doing is you're setting your brain up to give your perspective, the way you see things, the priming that they need to make the thing happen, as opposed to not happen. Second rule of the mind is the mind tries to move you away from pain and tries to move you toward pleasure, right? So real simple example of this, if you put your hand on a hot stove, your brain is going to say, get your hand off the hot stove. Okay, very simple example of this. The mind tries to move you away from pain toward pleasure. Let's say that you have, so if you're like me, you have a tendency to eat sugar when you're unhappy or things aren't going well, right? So I gravitate towards food, and in particular, I gravitate towards sugary foods. And so this is my mind driving me toward pleasure, right? So if something is unhappy, if I'm happy about something, I seek out a donut or a cookie, right? I had a bad day, I'm stressed out, I'm going to seek out something to eat. So this is what the mind does, drives you away from pain and drives you toward pleasure. The good news is that once we sort of become aware of these things and we can be aware of them on a regular basis, we can actually sort of use these things to our benefit. The third rule of the mind is we are hardwired to move towards what is familiar, okay, while resisting what is unfamiliar. That was a mouthful, so let me say it one more time in a different way. So basically, we don't like to go outside our comfort zone. Our brain wants to keep us in what is familiar, right? So pushing ourselves to something that is unfamiliar can be very difficult. So let me come full circle with the story I told earlier about the zebra, right? And this is Axelrod giving me the sad face. So as I said, that may very well have caused me to live the subsequent 30 years of my life in the belief that I was not creative. So fast forward to college. So I'm now a freshman in college, and I'm taking the prerequisite or the required writing class that every student had to take when I was in college. Now I was pre-med because, again, I'm that left brain analytical person, right? So I was taking science and math classes, but I had to take this writing class. So I took a writing class and we had an assignment. Every student had to go write an essay. And I forget the parameters of it exactly, but so I go and I write, and I think that one of the parameters was it was supposed to be funny, right? Now I'm thinking in my mind, there's nothing funny about me. I don't make people laugh. I'm not a comedian. I'm not funny. I'm analytical. I'm not creative. I'm analytical. So I go and I write this essay, and I wrote it about the process of getting up in the morning with the alarm clock and wanting to stay in bed and all this. And I don't think I tried to make it funny, but maybe I did. Maybe I did have that intention. So we turned in the assignment, and then a week later, he comes back in class, and he's got the graded papers, and he says that he's got two winners. I'm like, what are you talking about? So he picked the two best essays in the class, and he started reading them, and he did it anonymously. So he never said my name. But about a couple of sentences in, I recognized my own words. Like, what? He's reading my essay. Why the hell is he reading my essay? I don't understand this. Well, in his estimation at the time, mine was one of the two funniest essays in the class. And there's about 30 people in the class. And so he read my essay, and I was a little bit, not sure what to think of this. Ultimately, here's the point. Again, what was comfortable for me, what was familiar for me, was the idea that I'm not creative. So I actually told myself, because this particular professor, his name was Dr. Neuhauser, he was a very short Jewish man, had an accent. He was a little bit quirky. He's a great guy, but he was a little bit quirky. So in my mind, I said, he's full of shit. He's just a weirdo. And the only reason he found my essay is funny is because he's weird. My essay is not really funny. This is just a fluke. And that's what I told myself. And that's what I ended up believing for years. I thought this was just a fluke. Well, nowadays that I've actually started doing some writing over the past couple of years, I realize I actually am a pretty good writer. And I actually can be funny when I try to be. But it was just that when the evidence was presented to me that I was a good writer, the actual evidence was right in front of my face. it was unfamiliar. And so I wrote it off and I chose to be familiar, which was I can't be creative. And so these are just the evil tricks that our brains play on us, you know. So the point of this one is, well, here's another, I'll give you another example. So there is a data point that I read about where 70% of lottery winners, people who win the lottery, who also grew up without money, end up in bankruptcy after 3 years, right? So if you don't have money as you grow up, if you're impoverished or you just never had a lot of money, and then all of a sudden you have a windfall, right? 70% likelihood you're going to be bankrupt in 3 years. Now, why is that? Well, it could be that being with money is unfamiliar to you and you don't know how to operate in that environment, right? If you struggled as a kid, you probably know that when your parents got a paycheck, you know, that paycheck got spent within the first week, right? And then you had to wait for the next paycheck. And so all you know is that you get money and you spend it. So that's what's familiar to you. And that sort of pans itself out with this data where they went and studied the lottery winners and found 70% of them have nothing after 3 years. In relationships, right? So if you were a child that didn't experience a lot of love from your parents growing up, if that's what is familiar for you, you're very probably going to find it difficult to have love in relationships as an adult because you're going to gravitate to what is familiar. And so your brain might actually be sabotaging you in relationships. You might be pushing people away when true love is presented to you because that's unfamiliar. It's makes you uncomfortable. It's a little icky because it's not what you're used to. And so you end up in relationships where you don't get that love, right? And I can go on and on with these examples, but let me move on to the next one. So number 4 is the mind cannot tell the difference between what is real and what is imagined. And this is an interesting one. So I have a coach of my own that I speak to every week, and he is a former Navy SEAL. And prior to my working with him, so I've been working with him for a couple of years now. Prior to this, I had started to learn about this notion of envisioning and the power of envisioning. So they've studied several like Olympic athletes, for example. And Olympic athletes spend, some of them anyway, spend time, obviously not just exercising and practicing their particular thing, but also going through mental visualizations of the thing, right? So and I remember one study I read, it was about swimmers. So swimmers obviously swim and they get good at swimming by swimming, right? But they also can get good at swimming by simply envisioning the swimming. And they actually have a study where they've studied this, and people who are these athletes who spend some time just going through the motions in their mind, envisioning themselves in the water and the body motions through the water, actually have that as they actually get better at their craft that way. So fast forward to this Navy SEAL I was talking to. He talked about how they practice in the Navy SEALs as part of their training, they actually practice visioning. And so one of the things they'll do is before they go into an operation, so say he had several deployments to Iraq. So he and his team of people, they're say camped out in front of a house that they're about to attack to get a bad guy, right? And one of the elements of their training is they will force the SEALs to go through and envision the exercise because they've got it all planned out, right? So guy number 1 is going to bust through the window. 2 seconds later, guy number 2 busts through the other window. They have like they have a diagram of the floor plan of the house. So this guy goes left, this guy goes right, the other guy comes in. They have this whole thing planned out, and they make them envision it before they do it. And what they found was that their error rate. So one of the things the Navy is very good at is they measure performance after the fact, right? So they measure the performance of all these operations, and they found that the rate of errors in the scenarios in which the SEALs were required to envision the exercise before they implemented it is much lower. So it actually works to improve performance. And it's really just kind of an amazing thing. So well, the point is that if you want to manifest something in your life and you envision it, it is much more likely to affect the wiring of your brain and actually manifest because the brain can't tell the difference between real and imagined. which I personally find pretty fascinating. The last thing I want to throw out to you is the mind learns by repetition. And so, we talked about this in the last call last week, that to change our mindset does require a little bit of effort. And you can get pretty good at it by repetition. So think of it as your mind is a muscle. If you want to work out and get big biceps and big pecs and big leg muscles, you have to go and lift weights over and over and over again. And the same way, if you want to strengthen your mindset, you need to do repetition. So what is the point of all of this? Now that we've established that the mind plays tricks, my suggestion to you, what I would invite you to do in your life is to trick it back. Okay. So if there's something that you're, let's say, avoiding to do, or if it's something that you believe that you can't do, let's say it's writing a book. That's one for me, because I've started writing a book, haven't made a lot of progress. But if there's something that you want to do, rather than tell yourself, I can't do that thing, or I'm going to fail if I try that thing, or it's too hard, or I've got to learn so many other things before I do that thing, which is all the crap I've been telling myself about writing my book, then that's what's going to happen. Very likely, that's the outcome that you're going to get. So if that's true, then just trick your brain back. So instead of telling yourself you can't, tell yourself, well, of course I can. And it's not going to be difficult, and it's going to actually be easy, and I want to do it. And even if you don't believe these things initially, what you're doing is you're reprogramming your brain to make it possible for you to actually end up writing the book, right? One of the things that happens, like for me, is these thoughts that I can't do the thing end up manifest as procrastination. So I tell myself, oh my gosh, it's going to be so hard to figure out what chapters I want for my book. And that just makes me feel overwhelmed. And then that feeling of overwhelm ends up turning into procrastination. And so now I got to go do something else. I've got something else I can do instead. So just trick your brain right back, right? Don't let your brain be in charge. You be in charge. Tell yourself what you want to do. Tell your brain that that's what you want. And more likely, that's what will happen. We also have to get out of our comfort zone. So we talked about this, right? The familiar and the unfamiliar. The idea that I could write a funny essay that was the funniest in the class, that was unfamiliar for me, right? But imagine what might have happened for me had I embraced that and allowed it to be, and then continued to do more writing and get better at it. Maybe I would have taken more writing classes instead of more science classes, because here I am a few years later and I'm not using my science in my life or my math in my life, right? I'm using the writing. So just, you got to get yourself out of your comfort zone. Go into the unfamiliar forcibly and make it become familiar, right? So the more you push yourself into the unfamiliar, the more that the unfamiliar becomes familiar. And finally, this goes back to the envisioning I was talking about. So imagine, envision, and repeat, right? So the things that you want in your life, whether it's you want a better relationship with somebody, whether it's you want a better job, whether it's you want better health and you want to get to the gym more often for more exercise, or whatever it is, try, and if you're having a lot of resistance or you're having trouble making those things actually happen, try imagining them. Just let your brain be creative and let your brain do make-believe. Envision the things that you want and then repeat it. Once you do it, then repeat it. You go to the gym for one day, repeat it over and over again until it becomes familiar, until it becomes easy for you to do and comfortable. So that is what I wanted to share. And I'd be happy to open up the discussion and take any questions.